battle of wills between the US and China. The assumption is, from our side, that it's going to be us. And that assumption is based on the fact that the West has more power, that the United States is preponderant across that whole range of varieties of national power that I mentioned before, that it is the new Rome, and also that the United States and its allies have more will, that we're more determined to preserve the order than the Chinese are to overturn it. And that's what I want to contest. I think both of those are wrong. It's much, much harder to deter China from testing the United States over Taiwan than I think we understand. And it's much, much harder to win the war if we fail to deter them. And that means it is much, much harder for the United States to preserve its primacy in East Asia as the foundation for the Asian order. And the reason for that is really fundamental. And of course, at one level we all know it, but I think one of the challenges we all face is that we've all been living with the rise of China for so long that we've stopped focusing on what a remarkable thing it is. The Australian government a few months ago published several times it's published its own estimates of these of the raw economics, and the most recent of them was published just a couple of months ago in a rather obscure publication by DFAT, which didn't get any publicity, but it included Treasury estimates, our Treasury's estimates, of the relative size of the Chinese and the American economies in purchasing power parity terms, which is the more relevant measure for strategic purposes, between the US and China today and in 2035. Today, China's economy, according to these estimates, is 19% of global GDP and America's is 16%. 19 to 16. But that's not the scary bit. The scary bit is in 2035, which is the day after tomorrow, they're estimating that China's economy will be 24% of global GDP and America's will be 14%. Now, I don't know about you, but I kind of find that impossible to imagine. We sort of grow up with the idea that America is almost by definition the largest economy in the world. Well, it just isn't. And not by miles. It's not just the Chinese are snuck ahead by half a metre. And these are sophisticated calculations. They're not making any sort of dumb straight line extrapolations. It takes into account the demographic challenges, for example, that China faces, and the way in which the Chinese economy is changing in composition as it matures. And that really matters because throughout history, strategic weight power does derive essentially from economic scale. Why was Britain the world's strongest economy and the strongest power all through the 19th century? Because it had the biggest economy. Why was America the world's strongest power all through the 20th century? Because it had the biggest economy. We should not kid ourselves that those numbers don't mean that China is going to be by a long chalk the most powerful country in the world in the decades ahead. I think we do kid ourselves about that a bit. We somehow think that the laws of arithmetic don't apply to them as they do to us. That would be a very dangerous illusion indeed. And what that means is that we can't rely on our economic weight. We, the West, America in particular, can't rely on its economic weight or the charm of its diplomacy to counteract China. It is going to come down to that military contest. And the challenge of deterring China or defeating it is made all the harder by the massive resources, including technological resources, that China can bring to bear. Now, this is a big subject, and I'm going to go over it very quickly. But whereas it would once have been the case that the US would have won a war with China over Taiwan easily and quickly and cheaply, and when I say once, as recently as 2000 or 2005, that would have been the case. By 2010, it was becoming a bit harder to be confident. But today, actually, it's very easy to be confident. The United States cannot win a war with China over Taiwan because the Chinese have very effectively developed the air and maritime capabilities to deny the United States the capacity to project power to the waters around Taiwan, which they used to take for granted. And what that means is that a war between the US and China over Taiwan, which would, it's worth making the point, be the first great power war since 1945, first war between, or serious war between two great powers. We've had little border clashes, but no serious wars between two great powers since 1945. It'll be the first maritime war since 1945. And it will be the first significant war between nuclear powers, two nuclear powers ever. Again, little border clashes between India and Pakistan, but we haven't seen anything nearly as serious as this would be. So it will be a very new, big, different war. And it's a war that I think we can very clearly say America cannot win as a conventional conflict. Now, notice I says can't win. It doesn't mean they lose it. You can't beat America that way, but you can't beat China either. They fight one another to a standstill. They do it quite quickly. I think it only takes a couple of weeks. It will be extremely costly. America would lose lots of aircraft carriers if they dared to deploy any into the theatre. Lose lots of aircraft, lose lots of ships. China would lose a lot of aircraft and a lot of ships and would have its bases in the mainland of China attacked. So both sides would find themselves after a couple of weeks bloody but unbowed and very angry. And both would ask themselves, how can we break this stalemate? And although there's quite a complex argument underpinning this, I think it's pretty clear that the two sides both conclude that nuclear weapons provides the only option. And both sides, I think, would be seriously tempted to go nuclear. One of the things that's happened in the era of uncontested US primacy is that we've forgotten about nuclear weapons. With the end of the Cold War, the nuclear confrontation eased, the Cold War nuclear confrontation. But the nuclear weapons didn't go away. Their numbers reduced, but the arsenals are still easily big enough to cause an unimaginable catastrophe. And I think there's a very real chance, and I think it's pretty clear to decision makers on both sides, there's a very real chance that because neither side can win a conventional conflict, both sides would feel impelled to go nuclear relatively quickly. And that all has very big implications. The most important implication is that that means it's very hard to deter China from having a go, because that is for risking a military attack on Taiwan, because it's hard to persuade the Chinese that America would start a war that it can't win, and would start a war that might go nuclear. And by going nuclear, I mean including nuclear attacks on US cities, over an issue like Taiwan. And that suggests that we face two very dangerous possibilities. One is that the US, confronted with the chest from China, steps back and abandons Asia. And the second is that it doesn't, but it starts a war it can't win. And its leadership in Asia is destroyed anyway. Now, what all of that tells you is that defending that US-led global order that I started talking about at the beginning is not going to work. The US doesn't actually have the power or the resolve, the motive, to sustain the position that they thought they'd adopted at the end of the Cold War. And it's really for the most basic of reasons. It's it's a change in the distribution of wealth and power in the decades since the end of the Cold War, which has been the biggest, as I say, the biggest and fastest and most significant shift in distribution of wealth and power probably in human history.